I'm Timothy Vigil, and this is Just Another Word, the word podcast for storytellers. Episode 46, Arbitrary. Existing or coming about seemingly at random or by chance, or not restrained or limited in the exercise of power. We can often look for meaning in our stories. We want the precedent of cause and effect, easy stories with clear lines to follow, defined character arcs, and story structure that makes perfect sense. But some of the most terrifying and fascinating forces in history and fiction are those that refuse to follow a pattern. The roll of the dice, the whim of a tyrant. Today's word is arbitrary. To understand arbitrary, you have to look at the seat of judgment. It comes from the Latin arbitrarius, meaning depending on the will of a judge, or arbiter. Originally, an arbiter was someone chosen to settle a dispute based on their own discretion, rather than a strict code of law. An arbiter was the person who got to make the choice. It was on them, purely on them. So when you call a character's choices arbitrary, you're saying there is no empirical logic to their action, or there doesn't need to be. And there is only their own internal, unpredictable preference. They are making the decision based purely on what they want. When it comes to the arbitrary exercise of power, it is the absolute monarch of the early modern period that we should look at, such as Louis XIV of France or Henry VIII of England. In the system of the absolute monarch, they were the law. Their whim was what made the decisions. In these systems, the law was not necessarily a fixed foundation. It was whether the king decided that it was that day. In the court of an arbitrary ruler, a person could be promoted to a dukedom or sent to the executioner's block based on nothing more than the king's mood or preference. This created a world where merit and moral strictness don't matter. The only thing that matters is proximity to the source of power and the ability to guess which way the wind is blowing. In your stories, an arbitrary leader creates a climate of constant fear. If the rules are changing every single day, the characters can never truly feel safe. It forces them to stop relying on the system and start relying on their wits. In a narrative, the arbitrary archetype is a test for your protagonist. It represents a world that doesn't care about their intent. Think of a villain like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. When he forces a character to flip a coin for their life, he's removing all logic from the conflict. The death is completely arbitrary to him. It doesn't matter if the character is good or bad, it only matters how the coin lands. And this is often a good way to play out arbitrary in characters who you want to feel this way. Flip a coin, whether that's really or just in your head or in the character's head. But allow their decisions to be unpredictable. See, because conflict arises when a character expects a tradition or a fair trial, only to be met with an arbitrary dismissal. This subversion of fairness is one of the quickest ways to make a reader root for a rebellion, for a change, for the execution of this king, for the removal of a tyrant. You can use arbitrary events to challenge your character's philosophy. How does a stoic character react when their life is ruined by a random accident? How does an empirical scientist cope with the phenomena that defies data? Using the idea of arbitrariness in your characters, particularly in your leaders or your antagonists, or even in events that are happening in your world, can create a sense of reality. Not everything that happens in our world follows logical sense. Often, the arbitrary decisions of someone in power can change things for dozens of people. You can use the concept of an arbitrary environment to ground your world building. If you describe a city's bureaucracy as arbitrary, You're telling the reader that this is a place where corruption and personal favors are the only thing that move the needle. Like George R. R. Martin using the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen, to ground the history of Westeros. You can use an arbitrary ruler to explain why your world is in ruins. When power is exercised without restraint or necessity, the result is a society that is always on the brink of collapse. It makes the status quo feel like a thin layer of ice over a dark, unpredictable ocean. Arbitrary characters change the path for everyone, not just for themselves. They become a tool that you can use to shift the narrative from one linear direction into a completely different one. The word arbitrary reminds us that not every plot event has a logical cause. Sometimes the most realistic thing you can do is flip a coin in your head and make a decision that is arbitrary. In your next draft, look at your plot. Is every outcome earned? What happens if you introduce an arbitrary obstacle? Use the unpredictable to keep your characters on their toes. Now, don't do this too often. If your whole plot feels arbitrary, people are going to get upset. But having some obstacle that falls into the way, something that isn't necessarily caused by the villain, that gets in the way, having an unknown parade that gets in the way of your protagonist's abilities to pull off their heist, something that they weren't expecting but isn't put there by somebody, this arbitrary thing can help so much in making the world feel unpredictable. And use the unpredictable to keep your characters on their toes, to keep your readers engaged, because this tool, the idea of arbitrariness, allows you to create something that your reader doesn't expect. I'm Timothy Vidrell, and this has been Just Another Word. Happy writing.